University and one of the team that has been working on the course and working to support you during the course. I'm going to introduce a couple of people, and then we're going to end with Professor Moulton, who's going to begin his question and answer with the questions that we've seen from the course from you. I want to introduce my colleague Pat, or let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Pat Pettyjohn. I'm an instructional designer here and helping out with the course.
Excellent. And then we're going to meet Kumal, who's been working in the discussion forums with you. Hi, Kumal.
Hey, everyone. I think you must have seen me on the board, quite active. So, yeah, it's me.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Ian. Connor may join us. If he does, we'll find a break and introduce him as well. But take it away, Ian, and we look forward to hearing the answers to your questions.
All right. Well, welcome everybody, and I'm going to run through some of the questions that we got on the discussion boards, and also the questions that we posted on the board for the Hangout. And then I think we'll take some time and just look at the discussion questions that you've been writing on over the course of the semester, and give a little background on those. So I'm going to sort of do these more or less chronologically, so we'll talk about the questions on Egypt and Mesopotamia first, then Greece, and so on all the way through. Well, one of the first questions is a really good one. We've discussed Egypt as part of the legacy of Western civilization. I would have liked a little more about Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian civilizations. What influence do they have on Greek and how Greek and Roman civilization developed? And this is a great question. Several people pointed this out, that, you know, the first unit's called Egypt and Mesopotamia, and we spend an awful lot of time on Egypt and not as much time on Mesopotamia, and there are a few reasons for this. One is just that there's more evidence remaining from Egypt. Egypt was a very politically stable society because of the geography of the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley is surrounded on two sides by the desert. You know, once you get away from the river, crossing the desert is really, really difficult. And south of Egypt is just more desert. You get down into what is now Sudan, and it's the same kind of thing. So if the Egyptian state could sort of keep good security in the Nile Delta, which they did, you can't invade Egypt. And so Egypt for millennia really had no internal conflict. And that meant that there was a lot of stability. They built, obviously, large structures like the pyramids, which have lasted, whereas in Mesopotamia is the plain that makes up basically the countries now of Iraq and Syria. And it's an area, as we see even today, an area of conflict. It's a wide open plain next to fertile rivers, surrounded by desert on one side and mountains on the north. And raiders come down out of the mountains, raiders come up out of the desert to the south. There are areas where cities are founded down near the Persian Gulf, but there are other areas where cities are founded on the other end of what's called the Fertile Crescent near Damascus. And what you get in Mesopotamia is sort of a history of constant warfare with one empire attacking another, and this creates a couple of issues for us doing this course. One is that the empires replace each other relatively frequently, so there is an awful lot of material to keep track of. You've got the Sumerians, you've got the Hittites, you've got the Akkadians, you've got the Persians, you've got the Medes, and this can be an awful lot of information to take in about sort of successive empires. The other thing is, because they were always fighting, they tore stuff down. A lot of the cities and structures that were built were torn down, and so in that sense, Egypt is just sort of easier to get a handle on when you've only got 1 week to cover this huge swath of civilization. Having said that, we focused on a couple of the major documents from Mesopotamia, the Law Code of Hammurabi and also the Epic of Gilgamesh, and those texts preserved on clay tablets come across, in some ways they're more accessible than some of the Egyptian texts that have survived, and they survived better in some ways. So that gives us some textual things to work with for Mesopotamia. As for the influence of Mesopotamia and Egypt on Greece, there was a lot of it, and we pointed to some of the main ones. They tend to be things that are so enormous that their influence is just truly massive, like the wheel. Mesopotamia seems to have been the first place where the wheel was developed, first as a potter's wheel, and then people figured out if you put them on the sides of sort of pieces of wood or boxes, you could create carts or eventually chariots. This was an invention that obviously, you know, has enormous worldwide impact, but it's so fundamental we barely think of it as an invention. Some of the calendars that helped people deal with agriculture and plant at the right time were developed in Mesopotamia. Another major development in Mesopotamia, near Mesopotamia, was the alphabet, which was first invented by the Phoenicians living on the coast of what is now Syria and Lebanon. So the Mediterranean coast, that area next to Mesopotamia. The Greeks really just took this and added vowels to it. And this is we talked about this a bit. It's a fundamental, huge difference to have a system of signs that don't represent things, they represent sounds. Sounds are very abstract if you think about it. We're so used to breaking down words by the letters that spell them that you don't think spell if you just heard that word spell. What are the sounds in spell? There's a us, a p, an eh, a l. To break that out into 5 different symbols rather than just have one symbol that stands for the whole word is not at all intuitive. It's very counterintuitive, and that's probably the main influence of Mesopotamia on future civilization, is these fundamental things like the wheel and the alphabet. But also the Greeks were, of course, in constant contact with the peoples of what's called Asia Minor, the Persians and so on. And so the successor states in Mesopotamia, the Greeks had more contact with them directly than they did with the Egyptians. So there's a lot of cross-cultural contact there in all sorts of different ways. Next question. I was surprised to read that the Code of Hammurabi talks about shekels. So shekels, this is money, were not only used among the ancient Hebrews. Does someone know more about this? What's the origin of this currency? Well, this was something I actually didn't know much about, and I looked into it when I got the question. And it turns out that the Law Code of Hammurabi is one of the earliest references to shekels. The word shekel is a Hebrew word, but it's also related to an Akkadian word. The word is siklu. And a shekel is actually a term for a weight of barley. About 11 grams of barley was 1 shekel. And so shekels originally weren't coins. They were, you know, how many shekels of barley do you want? And then, of course, people are trading barley for other things. Give me 3 shekels of barley for that piece of leather or something like that. Eventually, coins are invented in the area of southern Turkey that at that time was known as Lydia. And coins are invented by traders in Lydia who use them all over Mesopotamia and then into Greece and down into Egypt, because coins are useful. They're a very useful way of keeping track of who owes what to whom. And that's another answer to the first question. Coins are something that the Greeks get from Mesopotamia. So the word shekel becomes used widely through Mesopotamia and the area that is now Israel, Palestine, as a sort of standard word for coin, a standard kind of monetary unit, even though it begins as a measure for grain. And that's an interesting thing because it makes us realize that you're dealing with a barter economy much more than you are with a cash economy. Most people are trading things for things, not using money. And money just comes in later. So, but even in the Law Code of Hammurabi, they're talking about shekels, and it's not quite clear in the code whether you're talking about shekels as coins or shekels as units of weight. Another question. In the first lecture on Egyptian culture and art, Professor Moulton said the Egyptians thought there was a certain way things need to be represented, and Egyptian art didn't change in style for 3,000 years, but I thought Egyptian history went for 5,000 years. Does that mean there was a big change at some point? If yes, in what way? Well, Egyptian history, the standard sort of 3,000-year span is from about 3000 BCE to about the beginning of the Christian era, around the time of Cleopatra. Egyptian history, as Egyptian history, is usually understood to have ended when the Romans conquered Antony and Cleopatra, when Augustus conquered Egypt by killing Antony and Cleopatra and defeating their armies, which happened just before the beginning of the Christian era. So you've got about 3,000 years of history back. Now, Egyptian civilization goes further back than that. But 3,000 years ago is about when you start to have written and drawn records that you can measure by. History is usually understood as the period where something is written down. In other words, cultures have histories, but they also have prehistories before there's a written record or a pictorial record in some cases. So Egyptian art, the earliest Egyptian art, like some of the stuff we looked at the beginning of the Narmer palette, for example, the earliest surviving Egyptian art from about 3000 BCE looks very much like art that was created just before, the time of Cleopatra, and so you don't see a whole lot of change over that 3,000 years. Now, one of the things, of course, is we're living 2,000 years after Cleopatra, so if we talk about how old things are in Egypt, it's 5,000 years old, but really, if we're talking about ancient Egypt, that history goes from 3000 BCE to about the beginning of the Christian era. Another great question. I don't believe wheat and barley provide all the essential amino acids we require for health. Did Egyptian peasants have beans to eat? Did peasants generally have regular access to eating fish and meat? Well, this is a really good question, and it focuses on some of the deficiencies of ancient diets, not just in Egypt, but all over. We have a fairly sophisticated understanding of nutrition and what people need to eat and what makes for a healthy life, and a lot of our guidelines of what to eat are designed to keep us living healthy lives into our 70s and 80s. They didn't have any of that. They ate what they could get their hands on, and very often the diet was enormously deficient in things that we would think were necessary. Wheat provides a lot of nutrition. There are things, of course, that it doesn't provide. It provides more than most grains, which is why a lot of the Egyptian diet consisted of, on the one hand, bread, and on the other hand, beer, which are just different ways of sort of making wheat edible. Barley supplements that. Things are not provided. Lentils are another sort of basic grain or pulse that people would have been able to eat, and I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not sure if lentils and wheat provide the same kind of full protein that, say, rice and beans provide. The Egyptians, I don't believe, had a whole lot of rice, if any. That's something I really don't know about. As to whether they ate fish or meat, the answer, sadly, is no, they didn't. Those were very expensive things, hard to get your hands on in ancient Egypt. There are fish in the Nile, but how many peasants actually had access to fish in the Nile is unclear. Most of the fish were a luxury good anyway and would have been sold to wealthy people as a way of, the fishermen surviving. So fishermen's families probably ate a fair bit of fish, but as part of a regular diet, no, not a lot. Meat was even more of a luxury, and unless you were sort of in the Egyptian equivalent to the 1%, you didn't see meat very often. And this is why people died very young. There was some controversy in the early weeks of the course about, you can't mean that people actually were dying of old age at age 29 or 30 or 35. Yes, they did. As far as we can tell from skeletal remains, they did, because they were very poorly nourished. This doesn't mean you can't have a great civilization, because you can live long enough to have children and you can survive for a certain time, but in terms of modern life, Egyptian peasant life was very hard, and very often peasants in all places and times are by modern standards atrociously poorly nourished, and as a consequence age much more quickly than we do. Another great question. In the course it said that Akhenaten, the pharaoh, was the first who wanted to set up a monotheistic religion. What about Abraham? Abraham lived nearly the same time. Can't we say they had common relations? Was this a common way of thinking? Well, here we get into some really interesting questions about sort of what constitutes evidence. We know from Egyptian artifacts and archaeology that Akhenaten died sometime around 1335 BCE. And we know also from similar sources that he tried very hard to get the Egyptians to stop worshiping all the different gods they worshipped and to worship only the sun god Aten. And this was phenomenally unsuccessful, as you would imagine that it would be if one person, even the pharaoh, tries to just tell everyone to stop believing what they've believed for thousands of years. These are not easy transitions, and Akhenaten failed. He tried to get everyone to worship Aten, and it didn't last past his own lifetime. When he died and stopped telling everyone to do it, everyone went back to worshiping the gods they knew and trusted. So this is one of the first times that you ever get a state trying to impose monotheism or holding a monotheistic religion up as sort of the ideal, as the way it ought to be. And in some ways, it seems strange that more sort of kings and pharaohs didn't adopt this, because really it's kind of replicating in the world of religion what you already have in the world of politics. The pharaoh is the all-powerful. Why not have one all-powerful God? One of the things we see much later in Roman history, when Constantine converts to Christianity, in part he's bringing in monotheism, but in part he's just choosing the most powerful god he can find to be his personal god. All the Roman Empire emperors had gods that they thought favored them more than anyone else. Aeneas was supposed to be descended from Venus, so Julius Caesar, who believed he was descended from Aeneas, felt that Venus supported him and helped him win battles and things like that. So Venus was Julius Caesar's personal goddess. And he felt that she helped him more than she helped other people, and that his success was due to her. Well, Venus is a powerful goddess, but the Christian God is much more powerful. The claims that the Christian God makes as to be the only God and all-powerful, that's a good God to have on your side, and Constantine was just the first emperor to sort of do that. That succeeded, but it succeeded because there were a lot of Christians living in Rome and that would support Constantine's plan, and so that after Constantine died, there was a Christian power structure in the church and other elite Romans who thought that this worked. With Akhenaten, it didn't. He wasn't able to keep it going, and there was no sort of constituency, as far as we know, out there in Egypt for worshiping just the sun god. But what about Abraham? Well, this gets us into the question of historical evidence, and this is another question that we've been dealing with at various points in the course. The evidence for Abraham comes almost entirely from Hebrew Scripture, from the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis, we know, was written sometime in around the 6th century BCE. That was when it was first written down. We don't know exactly where or when. Most scholars who study Genesis believe that it was at the time of what's called the Babylonian captivity, when Jews were taken forcibly from Jerusalem and moved to the city of Babylon, and that at that time they started writing down a lot of oral traditions because they were worried that if they didn't write them down, they'd be lost, because they were being taken into forced exile. The temple was destroyed, the first temple. So how do you keep your religion going? One of the ways you do it is you write it down. You don't just have the oral knowledge that the priests pass from generation to generation. You write it down, and that's where we get the book of Genesis and some of the other early books of the Bible. Well, so in around 520, 560 BCE, you've got people talking about someone named Abraham who lived a long time ago. For a historian, this raises all sorts of questions. One is, was there really an Abraham, or is this just a tradition? That's impossible to tell, because traditions are often based on things that actually happened. So there may have well been a person called Abraham, or someone quite like him. We don't have any independent archaeological evidence I know of for Abraham, and this makes dating him very difficult, because the dating systems used are not necessarily accurate. If you've read much of the early books of the Bible, you'll see there are long lists of so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, which traces genealogies. That's the way that most ancient cultures dealt with past history. They wouldn't say that happened 2 years ago. They would say that Ian's father was Edward, and Edward's father was Frederick, and Frederick's father was Joseph, and Joseph's father was Bill, and in Bill's time there was a great war. And then you have to figure out, well, more or less, how long do these people live? How many generations are we going back? Did someone die young? Is the genealogy accurate? Because very often it's just a memorized list of names. You know, Bill begat Joseph, begat Fred, begat. If you forget one, you've lost 40 years of your chronology. Traditional biblical dating says that Abraham lived at about 2000 BCE, which would have put him 700 years before Akhenaten. Whether that's accurate, we don't know. And the tradition of the Exodus story puts it sometime around, I don't know, 1200 BCE. Well, Abraham is only a few generations before that, but then, of course, the other thing you get when you start looking at these ancient genealogies, and you'll know this if you're familiar with the early books of the Bible, everyone seems to have lived an awful long time. They talk about how people died 700 years old and full of years. Well, okay. Did they really live 700 years? Odds are not. Odds are that this is a way of saying how important they are and how venerable they are based on having, sort of a large number of years. Older than you, older than your grandfather, more important than you, more important than your grandfather. makes it really hard to do historical dating. The other question, the other part of this question is, I think, easier to deal with, which is, was there a connection between Abraham and Akhenaten? And as far as I know, none at all. Akhenaten was basically taking one god who existed in the Egyptian pantheon and saying, you know, this is the only real one. Whereas Abraham was worshiping a different god with a different name, from a different tradition, from a different culture. And it's highly unlikely that either of them, with their cultural roots and biases, would have found inspiration in the other. Just because an Egyptian did something wasn't a good reason for Abraham to do something. And no Egyptian pharaoh would do something because some nomad from Mesopotamia did it. So it looks like it's parallel development. The Zoroastrian religion in ancient Persia also sometimes tended towards monotheism. Same way, they would take a particular god and say, you know, this is the really important one. The Greeks did this too. If you read Platonic philosophy, you'll see that they're always talking about the one or the god. Are they talking about Zeus? Not really. They're talking about some kind of divine concept that's somehow above Zeus, but that's never really formulated. But there's a lot of Greek philosophy that talks about God as if God were unitary and not sort of Zeus and Aphrodite and all these different Greek and Roman gods. So you can see that monotheism is sort of coming up as an idea all over the place, but really only takes off successfully among the Jewish people and then moves from Judaism to Christianity and from Christianity to Islam, where if you look at the people who adhere to those religions today, you get the majority of religious people in the world are monotheistic, but that wasn't the case in the ancient world. Almost all of the ancient religions were polytheistic. And very often, monotheism began not by someone thinking, well, what if there's just one God, but by saying, this one God of the 500 we know of is the really powerful one, and then reducing the importance of all the others. So, interesting questions. Let's move on to the Greeks. Another good question about what's history and what's mythology. Why is the Trojan War a mythical war if humans have already discovered the ruins of Troy? Other than the story, which does seem very exaggerated, is there any evidence or information that would prove the war to be a myth? Well, it's hard to prove something to be a myth because you could prove something was historical. It's hard to prove that it's mythological. There is, of course, a city called Troy, and it was discovered in the 19th century by an amateur German archaeologist named Schliemann, who just read a lot of Homer and thought, I'm going to go dig. And he did, and he found the city of Troy. He also found some of the tombs in Greece that he believed were connected with Agamemnon and some of the Greeks and so on. So there's an archaeological record for a powerful city in Asia Minor where the Greeks knew Troy was, and there's evidence for Greek civilization that dated back to that period. That's about as far as we get with the Trojan War. If you look at the ruins of Troy, you can see there are about 10 different cities built on top of each other at Troy. And this is hard to figure out because Schliemann, who first dug it up, was an amateur and he didn't know what he was doing. And he made all sorts of mistakes and mixed all sorts of things up because he didn't do the very, very careful, painstaking work that archaeologists have to do to determine whether, you know, something's 2 inches deeper in the earth than something else. He just dug stuff up and put it in a big pile and said, look what we found. So that confused things at the site. But what's pretty clear is that Troy burned down more than once. Now, was this just an accidental fire, or was the city sacked? Probably the city was sacked, though. Old ancient cities caught fire sometimes. So there was a war in Troy. Not surprising. There were wars everywhere in those days. Was there a Trojan War where the Trojans kidnapped a Greek princess and the Greeks united to fight the Trojans off? We don't know. We just don't. Some of the earliest stories we have claim that there was. So there's quite possibly a basis for those stories, but in disentangling which piece, you know, which part of the story, was there an Agamemnon, was there an Achilles, we just don't have that kind of information to make those connections. What's more interesting in some ways is look at the significance of the mythology around the Trojan War, and one of the things that the Trojan War taught the Greeks was that if they wanted to defend themselves against people from the east, like the Persians, they would have to unify and get together under one leader with all their armies from all the different cities, which is what the Greek army at Troy does, that this would be a difficult thing to do, but that it was worth doing, that the leader would not necessarily be perfect, and Lord knows Agamemnon is not perfect. but that would be the price that would have to pay. That was a very useful lesson for the Greeks, that they would need to unify themselves to fight non-Greek enemies. So there's enormous cultural sort of significance there. The other thing is there really is a break in Greek culture. There was a culture centered in Crete and Mycenae in southern Greece around 1200 BCE to about 1000 BCE. And then what you have is what they call the Greek Dark Ages, where that culture collapsed for some reason. The Trojan stories we have from Homer are stories that come after the collapse, talking about what life was like before the collapse. And the collapse was pretty massive. The Greeks, for example, forgot how to write things down. That's one of the things that happened when their civilization collapsed in that period of several hundred years, because there are older forms of writing Greek called Linear A and Linear B, and those were completely forgotten. And Greek becomes an oral language for a few hundred years, and then they adopt the alphabet from the Phoenicians, and they have the Greek alphabet. But the earlier forms of writing were completely forgotten, and you have to think of what a catastrophe it would have to befall a society to lose, where everyone would forget how to write things down. So there was a real cultural break there, and a lot of the Homeric stories are sort of mythological stories about what happened in the time before, when things were more splendid, when people were bigger, when people were stronger, when people were more heroic, at the time before the disaster. And so that's a context for the whole idea of the Trojan War, is set in this kind of mythical time, even for the ancient Greeks. This was they didn't have direct historical connection to that time. They had it through stories and legends. Another question about dating, historical dating, not the other kind of dating. How did the people of ancient Greece date their materials? We date them by using BC, BCE, AD, or sometimes CE, Christian era, before Christian era, or the old terms before Christ for BC, and Anno Domini, the Latin term year of the Lord, for the modern era. Well, the Greeks obviously weren't counting down to a future event thousands or hundreds of years away, so how did they date? Well, one of the answers is they didn't. They had genealogies like the Hebrew Bible does. But when they did date, they tended to date from the founding of cities. This is certainly what the Romans did. The Romans set a date for the historical founding of Rome as they believed it. We don't know if that date's accurate, but they kept to it. And they would date back that way. But very often in the ancient world, dates weren't counted numerically. We like to count things with numbers and say, well, this is year 2015. Well, traditional societies, far more often they say, well, this was in the reign of King so-and-so, or as the Romans did it, it was in the consulate of Marcus Antonius and Marcus Tullius Cicero. That was, if you want the date, you have the date of who was the ruler in that year, or the first year of the king's reign. And this means you don't have to count so long. It was in the 5th year of the king's reign, and then you get a new king. Well, it was in the 1st year of the new king's reign. And we're so used to the idea that we can just count back in years like that, and that we can abstractly count back. I mean, we can talk about what happened in 10,000 BC if we want to, because we have a numerical system that just deals with everything through the abstractness of number, whereas most dating systems in the ancient world related to actual people and things. The year since the founding of the city, the 2nd year of the king's rule, the year of the consulate of Titus so-and-so. And that was the way that people kept track of dates. This makes it very difficult for people specializing in these periods to sort of coordinate chronological dates. You can see how hard it would be to figure out when Abraham lived compared to when Akhenaten lived, because you're dealing with Egyptian dates and then, sort of dates from other cultures, and some of these dates are not precise. Now a question about Greek democracy. For us now, everyone who is a legal citizen is allowed to vote. As a result, the notion of only a select few people being able to vote will naturally seem foreign to us. What exactly was the perspective of Greek people on the matter of their disenfranchisement? So this is a really good question about sort of voting in Greece. We tend to think that if you're a citizen, you vote. Well, one of the things we ought to remember is that this is a very, very new definition of voting even for us. As recently as 100 years ago, women could not vote in most Western democracies. They couldn't vote in the United States 100 years ago, England as well. So female citizens were not allowed to vote until relatively recently. There were other restrictions placed on people from various ethnic groups. The efforts to suppress the African American vote in the South following the Civil War are pretty well documented. So it isn't the notion that if you're a citizen you get a vote is a wonderful idea, but it's a very modern idea. In ancient Greece, there was never a concept that everybody should vote, not even all the citizens. That would have been a meaningless distinction to these societies. You would vote if you had a certain role in the society, and the Athenians pushed this out about as far as anybody did, but they still had a very restricted number of people who could vote. In Athens, you could vote if you were a male citizen, and that meant that there wasn't a property restriction. The Romans had property restrictions. You could only vote if you had more than so much property, and the logic for this was that what would you care about running the country if you didn't own any of it? If you just lived in it, why should you have a vote in how it's run? And this was a very powerful idea for a very long time, and it's still the way corporations are run. If you're a shareholder, you get a vote. If you're not a shareholder in a corporation, even if it's a corporation that influences your life every day, you have no vote. You don't own part of it. Why would you have a right to say how they ran their affairs? You're not an owner. The notion that you vote because you're a citizen is very modern and starts really only with the American and French revolutions. And even then, it's limited to male citizens of certain races, sometimes with property restrictions. So how did Greek people feel about being disenfranchised? That's a very hard question to answer. If you look at a play like Aristophanes' Lysistrata that imagines women taking over Athens and running the city. That's a fantasy. That's a crazy fantasy. It would be like the same way we would say, what if 5-year-olds ran everything? You can imagine it, but no one's getting out there to agitate for 5-year-olds to have the right to vote. We still restrict, by the way, citizens on the basis of age. If you're under a certain age, you can't vote. The Greeks, the same thing. They just limited in different areas. Were there Greek women who wanted to vote? Maybe. There were probably certainly Greek women who wanted more say in how the city was run or wanted more power. But whether they thought of that in terms of voting rights or whether or not is hard to say. Slaves, of course, had no rights at all, being property instead of people. Every once in a while they would revolt. It always ended badly, and it didn't happen nearly as often as you would think it would. Slavery always has been a very efficient system for keeping people oppressed and chained up. It's very, very hard for slaves to revolt, and when they do, the success rate is very poor because they don't tend to have the organizational skills, having been slaves, to be able to run things once they're freed of whoever's oppressing them, at which point a better organized army comes and crushes them, which is what happened to the biggest Roman slave revolts with Spartacus and so on. Tens of thousands of slaves organized themselves into an army, and they could only do that because Spartacus had some military training. But then they had no way to connect the army with any kind of with any kind of the rest of civilization that would give them food to eat and things like that. So they were an army that sort of wandered around trying to find food. And when you're an army that wanders around taking food from people, and people don't like you much, and a better organized army led by the Senate, the Romans were very good at organizing armies, destroyed the Spartacus revolt, crucified thousands and thousands of people, lined them up for hundreds of miles along the highways, just one crucifix after another, with slaves nailed to them to tell the slaves, don't do this again. Very sad, very upsetting, but yeah, not much there in terms of rights. And just one last thought on that, the whole idea of human rights really dates to the 18th century. Before that, the idea that human beings had rights as human beings was just wasn't in play. The best you would get would be the religious notion that all souls were equal in God's sight, or the souls of all believers were equal in God's sight. That's the best you could get, but that was always for the world beyond. Suffering here was part of the deal. So, question about Sparta. I understand there's not much information about Sparta, but aren't there some information in inscriptions? Surely the Spartans must have had funerary inscriptions for their heroes. This is a really good question. I don't know that much about Spartan burial practices and so on, but yes, there are Spartan inscriptions. What you don't have from Sparta is written texts, like in Athens. They just didn't produce texts, and this is something to think about too. We often think we often think the best way to share information is by writing it down and then sharing the documents, and that works pretty well for us. And in some ways the internet is just an extension of this. Now we share images and videos and so on, as well as documents. In a lot of traditional cultures, the idea is the way you share information is orally. You pass things down orally, and then nobody can get the information except the people who are supposed to. So you have a priestly caste who train the new generation of priests. Nothing's written down. You learn from your elders. Same with a political class, somewhere like Sparta. The Spartan constitution is described in a text by Xenophon, but Xenophon was an Athenian who thought Sparta was really cool and spent some time in Sparta and thought their government was interesting and wrote it down, which is what Athenians tended to do. Athenians like texts. And so the best textual account of how Spartans actually ran their state was written down by an Athenian. The Spartans didn't really want other people to know how they ran their state. They didn't think it was anybody else's business except theirs. And they did not have a sort of culture that was deeply based in writing. So yeah, the record is much thinner. They were enormously politically and militarily important, but culturally they just haven't left so much of a trace because they didn't use writing the same way that the Athenians did. Another question about Sparta. Spartan women could be citizens, unlike Athens, providing their husbands were citizens. If a citizen spouse died, would the widow retain her citizenship? Could the widow remarry? Probably yes, in order to continue to breed future military. Would the widow lose her citizenship if she married a non-citizen? Could an individual from Sparta marry an Athenian? If yes, could they intermarry? How would the laws of citizenship work? Could a citizen marry a slave? Could the citizen free the slave and then marry? These are all great, great questions. I would have to check to see what happened to Spartan widows, but my sense is that you did not lose your citizenship in Sparta when your husband died. Greek city-states, however, were enormously protective of citizenship rights, partly because citizenship rights were privileges. They gave you things that other people didn't get. And in Athens, it was illegal for an Athenian to marry a non-Athenian. Period. Full stop. End of story. To be an Athenian citizen, you needed your mother and your father to be Athenians. Keep in mind, these are not big places. People know who your mom and dad are, and your mom and dad aren't just Athenians. They belong to a deme or a tribe, and they're part of a particular deme, and the demes live in particular neighborhoods and particular areas around the city of Athens out in the country, and people from different demes have different customs, and it's a very tight-knit collection of tribal communities in that sense. And so people know who people are, and marrying outside was just, it was illegal in Athens, even more so in Sparta. So the question of an Athenian marrying a Spartan, no way. Not going to happen, illegal, just... And of course the other thing is there's no reason whatsoever to actually do this, because this doesn't mean that you can't have children with or have relationships with. You just can't get married. And we're often thinking when we think of family and marriage of a modern situation where the norm is marriage or a relationship that looks like marriage, even if it isn't particularly, common law marriage or cohabitation or whatever, a couple that's committed to each other but just hasn't gotten married. Oh, the Greeks did all sorts of other things. They had concubines. Greek men had children with their concubines. There were children that were born with slaves that were part of the household, but they were born slaves. So there will be all sorts of relationships. The question is, what kind of rights would the children have, and so on. One of the most famous surviving court cases from classical Athens is a case about a woman named Neaira. And the accusation is that Neaira is posing as an Athenian wife when she is in fact a prostitute and the daughter of a slave, and that her Athenian husband is not really married to her, and that what they're doing is they're passing her children off, and this is what really horrifies people. They're passing her children off as citizens and enrolling them in the tribes. And we don't know the outcome of this case, but a long, long court case over whether she was a slave and whether she was married or whether, and the issue is not that they're a couple. It's fine for Neaira and Stephanos, the Athenian, to be a couple. The question is he claiming she's his wife legally, which means that the children would have certain rights. And a lot of this is based on what's happening with the children, not so much what's happening with Neaira. Neaira and Stephanos are living together, and who cares? But can the children join the demes? Can the children be married to Athenian citizens? And of course, all of this involves money, because marriage is never about, you know, in the ancient world, it's never just about two people who love each other very much. It's about two families with assets and making alliances and who gets what for what. And so there's an enormous amount of concern about, have they committed fraud by having married this person? So very complicated questions. Slaves, it's hard to get it through our heads, and it's a horrifying idea. Slaves aren't people. Slaves are things. You own them. You cannot marry a thing. Slaves can't be married. Slaves can be in all kinds of relationships. Now, in Rome, where you could free slaves, you could theoretically free your slave and then marry her. That would be extremely rare, because your slave would bring you nothing in terms of dowry, alliance, all the reasons people got married. Loving relationships, maybe. Marriage, probably not. Bad choice to marry someone who doesn't bring anything to the table. Question about Greece and Persia. Greece was able to defend itself from Persia before it was conquered. If it hadn't been if it had been conquered, how would that change trends in history? So the Greeks famously fought the Persians off several times. They beat them at Marathon, and then when the larger Persian expedition came, they lost at Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans, but they won at Salamis, the naval battle, and then they kicked them out of following other land battles. And the Greeks managed to stop the Persian invasions. It's really hard to do counterfactuals in history. What would have happened if this hadn't happened? Most of the things we associate with classical Athens happened after the defeat of the Persians, when the Athenians were very powerful, partly because they had defeated the Persians. And they had a lot of Greek city-states that sort of joined them. First, they joined them as allies, but the Athenians muscled them into sort of joining them as second-class allies, and eventually they were talking about an Athenian empire where everyone paid tribute to Athens. This started out as, you know, if you give us some money, we'll build some warships to protect you, but it ended up in, you pay us some money and you can be our empire. None of that obviously would have happened if the Persians had conquered Athens. So you wouldn't have the Parthenon, which was built on the ruins. The Persians did conquer Athens briefly and burned the place down, which is all of the great buildings of Athens that, you know, we now see the ruins of today, like the Parthenon. They were all built after they kicked the Persians out. So none of those, if the Persians had not been kicked out, none of those buildings would have been built. It's harder to say what would have happened with things like theater and philosophy, because eventually, of course, the Greeks were conquered. They were conquered by each other. The Athenians were conquered by the Spartans. Plato's philosophy was written after the fall of Athens to Sparta, after the defeat of Athens by Sparta. So Athens was not the powerful independent country that it previously was when Plato was writing. It had some independence, but it wasn't, it had been defeated in war and much reduced. So it's hard to say, would philosophy have developed the same way? Would cultural things like drama, Aeschylus wrote his tragedies in Athens, but he died in Sicily working for a tyrant. Euripides, too, the great tragedian, wrote one of his greatest plays in his old age, living with the Macedonians. He left Athens because he didn't like the Athenians. So it's hard to say political independence versus cultural production. There were other cities, Greek cities, a lot of them in what's now Turkey, that were perpetually being ruled by Persians, and they still produced things. But there's no question that things would have been very different. And that you wouldn't have had that sense of Greek independence. The one thing that probably really wouldn't have happened the way that it did is the notion that democracy is effective. Because before the 18th century, with the American and French revolutions, the idea generally was that democracy was a phenomenally ineffective, stupid way of running things. Because what it meant was any idiot got a vote. Why not just let smart and powerful people vote? That'll do better for you. The one example that countered this was the Athenians fighting off the Persians. And if the little Athenians could fight off the powerful Persians, there must be something to this democracy. If they had not won that battle, that argument wouldn't have been available to people like Thomas Jefferson and the French revolutionaries. So probably democracy as a form of government would not have flourished as it has if the Athenians had lost to the Persians. Now some questions on the fall of Rome. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, all the barbarians converted to Christianity. Why? From their perspective, they should logically conclude their pagan gods were more powerful than the Christian god. They sacked Rome. This is a great question because it opens up all sorts of interesting ideas about the fall of Rome. The old story of the fall of Rome is that Rome was this very organized Christian place with great civilization and wonderful culture that was attacked by these crazy nomads, barbarians, Vandals, Visigoths, and that these people were fundamentally un-Roman, and they just pillaged the place, burned everything down, tore everything up, trashed it, and it was wrecked. And recent research has turned most of this idea on its head. What tended to happen instead is that the borderlands of the Roman Empire were porous. That is, there were Roman armies defending the borders, but there were people living on both sides of the borders who were mostly farmers, and they weren't hunter-gatherers riding horses out of Central Asia. They were people who lived in the area and farmed. On one side of the Rhine, they farmed under Roman rule and paid taxes. On the other side of the Rhine, they were ruled by German warlords and didn't pay taxes quite the same way. These were the people who joined the army. Romans living in Rome didn't join the army. The people who joined the army were the people living on the border. In fact, a lot of the people who joined the Roman army were barbarians. They were Germans and Bulgarians and so on, because they were the people who were good at fighting, and they lived on the border anyway. The Roman side of the border tended to be the more prosperous side of the border, and what the barbarians wanted was a piece of it. They wanted to be Romans. They didn't want to tear down Rome. They wanted to join. And the Goths, which were the first group to came in, they came in as refugees because the Huns were attacking them, and the Huns really were these fearsome horsemen from Central Asia who lived on horseback and were militarily horrific, just very, very powerful and strong. And what happened was all these other peoples were pushed by the Huns across the border into the Roman Empire, at which point they wanted places to live, and the Roman state didn't give it to them. Promised them things, didn't fulfill the promises. These armed bands eventually attacked the city of Rome, and since they were the ones who made up the Roman army, I mean, some of them were in the Roman army, some of them were in the war bands, and at a certain point the Romans couldn't pay their army. And so you had all these just war bands wandering around. Every single one of these war bands wanted to be powerful and wanted to be Roman. And in those days, that meant being Christian, because the Christians obviously had a very powerful God, because their God claimed to be all powerful and also represented the empire. And so the barbarians were all of these different tribes, they wanted to join the idea of empire. They wanted to be more like the Romans. And so when they took over Christianity, it was to prove that they were the true rulers of Rome. Now, the problem was the way they did this resulted in a total collapse of Roman finance and infrastructure and government, so that taxes couldn't be collected anymore, so the armies couldn't be maintained. They might have been able to do without the armies, but then you've got marauding armies, because you don't have one state army that's protecting the borders. You have various groups of armed people wandering around looking for food. So you've got that. But the big problem is that the taxes didn't just pay for the army, they paid for the infrastructure, and all of a sudden the roads and the aqueduct and the grain supply start to stop working properly, and nobody knows how to fix them, because the new barbarian tribes, they're good at being soldiers, they aren't good at fixing aqueducts, and there's no central administration to organize it, and there's no tax base to pay for it, and so the whole thing falls apart. But the barbarians very much wanted to be Roman and to assimilate themselves to Roman cultural values, and once they got in charge of things, they really wanted to be Roman. They wanted to claim that they were the new emperors. And so to be an emperor, you had to be a Christian. And very often that was the way that it worked. So it's interesting. But yes, they all did want to be Christians. A related question. After the fall of Rome, how did the urban population survive without the Egyptian wheat? Did they start to grow crops themselves? Were the Romans moved from the city? How did they survive? Well, the reason that the Romans had to provide Rome and Constantinople with free wheat from Egypt was just a city of 1 million people or so, which Rome probably was is just not sustainable in the ancient world. They can't possibly provide enough food from the local areas within a day or two's. They don't have refrigeration. They don't have, they don't have container trucks. They don't have any of this stuff. They just put, they don't have ways of gathering food. So what they would do is they would provide food from places like Egypt and just mass ship it in once a year to feed the city. Once that stops, the city is totally unsustainable, and there's also problems again with the water supply, the aqueducts. You just can't have that many people living in one place. So what happens quite naturally, without anybody setting it up, is people leave. First, the wealthy people all leave because the city is just an unpleasant place to be, and they're worried about, if the food runs out. The reason they kept feeding everyone wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. It was so that the poor people wouldn't revolt and burn the place down. And once the food runs out, all the rich people leave town because they know that without the food, the poor people will revolt and burn the place down. So all of a sudden, the wealthy people who have 5 houses aren't living in their Roman house anymore. They're living in their house at Capri or their house in the hills. And they do quite well there very often with their nice local farm that is doing fine as long as a marauding band of vandals hasn't passed through, which most of the time they hadn't. But you have a collapse of a sort of centralized economy, and you can't sustain that kind of thing anymore. And so, yeah, the city depopulates itself. It goes from 1 million people at the height to, as low as 20,000, I think, in some of the early medieval period. I mean, the place just emptied out. And there was a large area of Rome that was just empty ruins. It was called the disabitato, the uninhabited part of town. And a very small part of the city was actually lived in. And large areas were just empty ruins. Next question is a big question that looks forward to the Middle Ages. In what way is common law different from Roman law? Well, we've got about 9 minutes left, and this could have taken the whole hour. But it's a great question, and we actually do address it in week 6 in some of the lectures on law. Common law, Roman law, is the law of the Roman Empire, and it's codified very late by Justinian, the early Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, and it's written down in a series of books. And this is civil law. This is sort of property arrangements and so on. Common law is a tradition that develops in England based on precedent, and it's based partly on Germanic traditions of law, which are different in many ways than Roman law. But it also, the big difference between Roman law and common law is the importance of precedent. And England and the United States and Canada and New Zealand and Australia and some other former English colonies all operate now under common law. And that's why you always see lawyers saying, well, in the case of so-and-so versus so-and-so from 20 years ago, this was decided. Common law puts a lot of weight into prior legal decisions. In other words, okay, there's a law, but how have judges and juries ruled on this law in the past? And if their ruling is upheld, then we should use that as a guidance for the new law, for this case that's in front of us today. Roman law goes back to the written law in the Justinianic Code. You go back to the code is the code is the code. Roman law forms the basis of most European country systems of law. Law in France, law in Italy, law in various other parts in Spain. Some of this is modified by Napoleon, the Napoleonic Code, which has some is used in some ways in Louisiana in the United States because of Louisiana's French tradition. These are complicated questions of sort of legal tradition and so on, but the main difference is that Roman law is based on the code and common law is more based on precedent. Common law comes out of as much a Germanic tradition as a Latin tradition, whereas Roman law is Roman law that came from the Roman Empire. Jumping ahead, getting to the ends of the questions, how were the Crusaders able to sack Constantinople in 1024 when, in 1204, while the technologically and militarily superior Muslims failed to do so for 800 years? This is a great question. Muslim armies, various ones for many, many years, were trying to take the city of Constantinople, which is a very, very well-defended city. And they didn't manage it until 1453, which is it's about 900 years after they started trying. So obviously Constantinople was not an easy place to attack. The way the Crusaders managed to do it in 1204 was that the Crusaders came to Constantinople as allies of the Byzantines. And what happened was they ran out of money. They were on their way to attack Jerusalem, which was being held by Muslim forces. And they ran out of money in Constantinople, and they needed money. Well, at the time in Constantinople, there was a dispute between two members of the royal family about who should be emperor. And the Christians were paid, they were hired by the one who was on the outs to win back the empire for them, which they did. But then he didn't pay them. And they got upset that he didn't pay them for their work, and they needed the money, otherwise they couldn't leave town. So basically they were living in the city. They were kept out of the main part of the city, but they were living right across an inlet of water called the Golden Horn that separates Constantinople from the downtown part, the central part of Constantinople, from some of the suburbs. And so they started their invasion from right next to the city walls in a place where an external enemy could never get. And they were lucky at getting, sort of infiltrating the walls, but they were able to, they had a good navy that was right next to the walls of Constantinople when the siege began. If they had come from further away and the Byzantines had advance notice of their coming, they never would have gotten so close as to get into the Golden Horn. And once they got into the Golden Horn, they were able to flank the city. They were able to infiltrate it. It was still very, very hard fighting, and nobody quite believed that they would be able to actually take the city. It came as a huge shock to everyone, including the Crusaders, that they were able to do it. But they did it basically by having, they had an in. They were able to start from a much better situation than Muslim armies coming from abroad were ever able to do. And of course, Constantinople was the last piece of the Byzantine Empire to fall. Everything else had fallen long before, and the city still held out for hundreds of years in the 15th century. Last question, I think, that we have time for: where did the Jewish diaspora have the best treatment in Europe after the destruction of the Second Temple? It was said the Jewish diaspora moved to Spain and Babylon, but we know that some Jewish tribes moved to Uzbekistan. Are the Uzbeki Jews considered a lost tribe? What's the name of this tribe? Well, I'm not sure about whether the Uzbeki Jews were considered a lost tribe. I don't think so. I think that's an earlier tradition. But the Jews spread all over the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world after the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Historically, the two places that they thrived the most during the Middle Ages were both under Muslim rule. They were in Spain, southern Spain, especially around the city of Cordoba, and in Baghdad. Those were the two areas, Baghdad and Iraq, those were the two areas where they had the most freedom, the most wealth, and the most sort of ability for their culture to thrive. This was partly because those were two of the most sophisticated centers of Muslim civilization, and Jews were respected in Muslim countries as common people of the book. Jews, Christians, Muslims. Jews and Christians were in some ways discriminated against by having to pay higher taxes, but they were often integral parts of Muslim communities. The ruling class would be Muslim in these places, but Christians and Jews would often serve as advisors, scholars, business people in these communities, and the Muslims didn't really see any problem with that. They never tried to eradicate either Judaism or Christianity as religions. They just thought these people were wrong, and since they were wrong, they should pay more for the upkeep of the government because they weren't part of the ruling religion. But there wasn't the notion that they should be stopped from doing what they were doing. Some accounts say that this was connected with sort of Arab ethnicity, that the Arabs were very proud that Islam was their religion, and that they weren't particularly concerned, especially in the early years of Islam, to proselytize. As long as they were ruling everything and they had their religion, they didn't care what the people in the other neighborhoods did. They could do whatever they wanted. To pay their taxes was the important thing, and not dispute, not pose any kind of threat to the ruling class. But there wasn't this notion that everybody, in the early years of Islam, that everybody should immediately become Muslim. You could stay Christian or Jew if you wanted to. You would just live slightly less advantaged lives for it. But compared to the conditions that religious minorities had to live under in Europe in this period, much, much better to be a Jew in Muslim countries in this period, in the Middle Ages, than in Christian countries, because the Christians did have this notion that Christianity was the correct religion and that everyone should convert. And so the Jews especially were blamed for persecuting Jesus, which the Muslims didn't really care about that. So there were those issues, and those were the two areas where there was the most thriving. And I see it's 11 o'clock. I think we're more or less out of time. I hope this has been useful, and have a great week.
Thanks very much, Ian, and we'll save this recording for the rest of the class who can attend.
Yeah.
Thanks again.